So according to Paul, they certified he's teaching the same thing they're teaching. Now, as historians, we can look and say, well, how do we know that Paul was telling the truth? Maybe he was just making up that story to give himself authority that he really didn't have. The reason he's good is because Paul, we know, was a skeptic. He was a non-believer. He didn't like the Christians. He believed it was God's will to destroy the movement that Jesus had started. And so he goes out and he was arresting Christians, sending them to prison, consenting to their executions. And then he became one when he had an experience he believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him. And that experience radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Paul then went from persecutor to persecuted, being thrown into prison, being whipped, being beaten, being stoned, and then eventually he was martyred outside of Rome by being beheaded. Okay? So Paul knew the Jerusalem apostles as well. And Paul claims to be an eyewitness to the risen Jesus. His writings predate any of the Gospels. In fact, it's probably the earliest in the New Testament literature. Paul, 3 years after his conversion, says in Galatians chapter 1, he went up to Jerusalem and he met with Peter, the lead apostle, for 15 days and asked him, he got a history of Jesus and what he had said and did. And because he wanted the whole 9 yards from someone who had actually been with Jesus. And he also met with James, the brother of Jesus at that time. Then in Galatians chapter 2, Paul says that 14 years later, he goes up to Jerusalem and he meets with the pillars of the church. And he names them Peter, James, and John. And he says the reason being is he wanted to run the gospel message. I want you to remember that, the gospel message. He wanted to run the gospel message he had been preaching past them to ensure he was preaching the same thing they were preaching. And he said they affirmed that he was preaching the same thing they were preaching. They extended the right hand of fellowship to him. In other words, fist bump, Paul. Good job. Keep up the good work, brother. So according to Paul, they certified he's teaching the same thing they're teaching. Now, as historians, we can look and say, well, how do we know that Paul was telling the truth? Maybe he was just making up that story to give himself authority that he really didn't have. So, as historians, we look for corroborating data, and we have that. You see, there's a guy named Clement of Rome, and he was known to have been a disciple of the Apostle Peter. And he is writing after Paul's death, and he calls Paul the Blessed Paul, and in fact, in another passage of his letter to the church at Corinth, he places Paul on par with his mentor Peter. And then there's another guy named Polycarp. Now, anybody pregnant in here right now? Anybody? No? Oh, over there. Do you know if it's a boy or girl? Girl? Ah, too bad. I don't mean it that way. The joke doesn't work as well, but that's what I mean. See, if it's a boy, I'd be suggesting a name like Polycarp. Keep that in mind. It's a cool name, don't you think? So maybe you can, no, you don't like that name? So Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. And Polycarp wrote in his letter to the church at Philippi that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. And in the same letter, he quotes from Paul's letters twice and refers to them as part of the sacred scriptures. These aren't the kinds of things you say about Paul if he was teaching heresy different from what Peter and John had been teaching. Precisely the kind of things you expect if Paul was telling the truth that they had certified, that the apostles had certified he's preaching what they're preaching. Look, I've got more evidence I could share, but I don't have the time. That should suffice, though, to show that when we are hearing Paul on the gospel message, we are likewise hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles.